Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Robert Swartwood here. Tonight, I am joined by an award-winning author of two short story collections and five novels, whose most recent novel was Joe Hustle. That's right, it's your favorite writer and mine, Richard Lange. Richard, how the heck are you?
I'm good, man. Thanks.
Yeah, so I was telling you in the green room years and years ago, I read Angel Baby. And I don't know about you. I have too many books, especially ebooks. And I don't know, sometimes I just pick up a book on the stack somewhere. And I don't know, it's years later. I still remember parts of that book. So I definitely want to talk about Angel Baby. But before we start, actually, you have a Wikipedia. And every time someone I chat with has a Wikipedia, I do like a Rich Eisen celebrity true or false. Let's go through this real quick and see what's accurate here.
Okay.
It says that you received your degree in film from University of Southern California. Is that
That is
correct?
correct. I did get a degree in film, but I did the minimum to get it. I had already started moving into writing fiction, and once I came to film school from a very small town in California. I'd never made a movie in my life. I somehow got accepted to USC Film School. I still don't know how, but once I got there, I realized like, oh, this is this is collaborative, and I for some reason that had never struck me that film was a collaborative art, and I didn't really like collaborating, so I started taking a lot of well, a couple. I took two or three fiction writing classes with T.C. Boyle, who taught at SC, and I
I
started.
love T.C. Boyle. I want to talk
Yeah,
about that too because I saw that he had blurbed some of your short story
yeah.
collection.
So then I did whatever minimum I had to do to get through film school, but I knew that I would probably be more into the fiction writing than in the film business, and it's worked out that way, I guess.
So was the initial, I mean, what was the initial reason you went into film? Like to be a screenwriter, director? I mean, what was the ultimate, or let's go back even a little bit further. Like at what age? Do you remember the very first like creative thing you did, whether it be a story or
Yeah.
whatever, a poem.
I've been writing as long as I could read. I was always writing. I remember writing stories in third grade, fourth grade. I wrote plays, that got put on by the whole school back then. Uh, in sixth grade, I wrote a poem that I got accused of plagiarizing. They brought my mom to school, and I didn't plagiarize it. And so I'd always been interested in that. I started to get interested in film as a teenager, around the time of like Jaws and stuff like that, and Star Wars. Film, uh, film, and the making of films became easier to see and to access. It's not like now where you can watch anything you want, but you start seeing the making of documentaries, and so I thought, yeah, that looks cool. I would like to make Jaws, or I would like to make Star Wars, and I just applied to film school on a whim. I applied to UCLA and USC and Irvine, and I got into SC and went because, why not? I had a scholarship, and so I went. And like I said, I quickly fell out of it. But yeah, I've been writing forever. It's always been there.
So what were you reading at that time? I mean, I look at you now and I see you more as a crime writer. I see you more as a literary crime writer. I feel like you have a literary sensibility towards your writing and then towards how you approach your novels. And I could be wrong. I don't know if you agree with that. But what were you reading at the time? Like was it crime stuff? I mean,
No, I
or was it
started
different
out.
things?
I started out with comic books, Marvel comics, Classics Illustrated. I was reading books from an early age, but it was the classics: Treasure Island, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I went through a heavy sci-fi phase, from about 12 on. I was reading a lot of sci-fi, and I was super into the Doc Savage novels. Do you remember those? It's Doc Savage, who's a pulp series that they reprinted in the 70s with these awesome covers, and you could buy like all 52 of them. And I sort of got into things like that. I was into, yeah, like into sci-fi, but then when I was about 16, I always say that the year I was 16, like everything sort of changed. I saw Taxi Driver, I read On the Road, and I listened to Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run record, like in that one year, and suddenly like my mind was opened up to the possibilities, like, oh, you can write stories about real life that are as compelling as these sci-fi things that I was into up to that point. And it literally was like a door closing and another door opening. I never read science fiction again, and I started reading literary stuff. I started with Steinbeck and Hemingway and the things that a young guy would read. And then when I got into college, I got introduced to people like Raymond Carver, and I had my short Bukowski phase. And but crime was never has never been a big thing for me. I liked Elmore Leonard a lot, but I never really considered that crime writing. For some reason, I just thought he was a good writer.
He,
And
and I don't think he really considered himself a crime writer either.
yeah, maybe maybe I'm about to read the bio, so maybe I'll learn there what he thought. But so I was into that, and then I didn't really, and I read Chandler and people like I read them all, Hammett and those people, but it really wasn't my thing. I was kind of a snob, like a literary snob. But when it came time to actually, and then I started writing short stories, and that was a whole thing. But when it came time to write a novel, I decided to write a crime novel because my short stories were, they're incident based. They're not really plot driven. You just have like a bunch of scenes, and at the end, I would somehow try to find a way to make them wrap up and make it into some sort of coherent story. You can't really do that for a novel, or at least not the kind of novel I wanted to write. I wanted to, for being a person who's into literary novels, I wanted to write a novel that would be more reader friendly. That could get. I wanted to write a book that would sell. So I said I got to come up with a plot. I've got to come up with some sort of overarching story that'll pull people along. And I'd never been interested in plot. I hated plot. I thought plot was the least interesting part of any book I ever read. It just didn't interest me. I was much more into character and settings and the actual writing on the page, the construction of that. So, but I needed something. So I said, well, what do you? I know, everybody knows the story of in a crime story, someone dies at the beginning, and then you find out who did it at the end. I go, well, there's an easy structure that I can lay down into this, as a track, basically to pull me along, to keep me from stopping and diverting into different things. So that's what I did on This Wicked World. I just of course, I blew it, and the structure kind of got exploded after the second chapter because you find out who did the killing, and you start following the killer at the same time as you're following the guy solving the mystery. So it didn't really turn out to be what I thought it was going to be, but it got me pegged as a crime writer after that,
Yeah.
even though it was, I don't know if it was strictly crime. I mean, I've never written about cops, never written that kind of book, never written a procedural or anything. I've always tried to find other ways into that genre that would keep me interested and hopefully would keep a reader interested. But it's for me it was a necessity of finding a form that I could use. That's why I went to crime as a thing, and I ended up writing three books that could be classified as crime. They call them literary crime, like you say, but I just call them books because that's what they are to me. I mean, they're what I wanted to write, and I was able to, within the strictures of this genre, I was able to do everything I wanted to do and experiment with language and use character and all the things that interest me. I was able to include that within these. So I enjoyed writing them, and people read them. So
Yeah.
they kept, they kept giving me contracts. So
Yeah, so it's a good thing. So yeah, I want to come back to this with Wicked World. I mean,
yeah.
the publisher does, if anybody goes to like Amazon or wherever, the product description right off the bat says, they kind of could compare it. It's like Elmore Leonard meets Dennis Johnson. So
Mhm.
there were those comparisons there. But going back to Wikipedia here, so you attended University of Southern Cal,
Yep.
and then you taught some. I guess you traveled Europe. You taught some English in Barcelona.
I did that trip that everybody does after college. Went to Europe and ran out of money and needed to get a job. I was in Barcelona at the time, and so I bought a sport coat at a secondhand store. I went into Berlitz. I'd never taught English in my life, and went in and barely spoke Spanish. I spoke, gutter supermarket Spanish that I'd learned. I worked for 5 years in a supermarket in college, so I had that kind of Spanish, and somehow I got hired to teach at Berlitz. So I did that for 6 months or so, and then got homesick and came back and had to find a job.
Yeah. And then you said you got hired as a copy editor for Larry Flint Publications and eventually became a managing editor of RIP.
Yeah.
Did you ever meet Larry Flint?
Yeah, many times.
Yeah.
It was yeah, I was working in a bookstore, and a friend had been working there in the art department, and she came and said, with my fancy USC cinema degree, I was in this working in this bookstore, and a girl came in and said, "Hey, you read, don't you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I read." "And you know how to write?" And I'm like, "Yeah." She goes, "We're looking for a copy editor at Flint." And I'm like, "Sign me up. I'll go do it." And I had to go take a test, and I passed the test and got in, which it was, to me, it was the greatest job in the world because I wasn't working retail anymore. I had a desk, I had like a health plan and vacation, and I was making more than, I think I was making $5 an hour at the bookstore. So I was making more than $5 an hour, and it was the greatest thing in the world. But in other ways, it did turn out to be the greatest thing in the world because other people who worked there were super serious about their jobs, and they were all sort of veteran journalists who had followed Larry out from Cleveland, I think it was, to start the big LFP that it became and the big company that it became. So the people who were teaching me to copy edit and later edit were all super pro, and we had a style book that was like hundreds of pages long. And if you messed up and you didn't, if you used your commas wrong or did this, they would come in and excoriate you. They'd scream at you. They'd humiliate you, which they couldn't do at a regular job, but because it was Flint, they just, they'd go crazy on you. So you very quickly became a good editor. And yeah, Larry was around all the time. At the time I was there, he was sort of, him and Althea was still alive, his wife. They were both pretty much on drugs, so they just wheel him around in his gold wheelchair, and he'd, say, "Who the hell are you?" Like every time he saw me in the hall, and I'd actually run in the bathroom and hide every time he came on the floor because I didn't want to have to talk to him. But yeah, it was a good place. A lot of good stories. It was a lot of people that I worked with there have gone on to become screenwriters, novelists, done a lot of work because it's one of the few places that provided work for people who considered themselves writers or wanted to be writers. In LA, everything is movies, and there's not much publishing work. So it provided a lot of people with that interim job before they jumped into whatever was going to come next in their career. But I worked on Hustler and Chic for a year as a copy editor. Then they offered me the job of managing editor on this heavy metal music magazine called Rip, and that Larry started. And that's what I did for like 8 years. I was managing editor on this heavy metal magazine. I was never really into heavy metal, but you know, I I could get into it enough to do this job, to edit the writers that were writing out. My job was to put the magazine together. I got the manuscripts, I edited the manuscripts, I took them all the way through to the art department. They laid them out. I made sure everything got on the page and it went out. And the editor in chief got to go play golf with Motley Crue and stuff like that. But I was just stuck in the office, which I preferred. I didn't want to play golf with Motley Crue, but
So
uh,
were you
interesting
writing at
job.
that time? I mean, were you doing short stories? Were you
Yeah,
publishing short stories?
I never, I never wrote for any of the magazines of journalism or anything because I don't know, I wasn't interested in journalism, and I didn't think I was very good at it anyway. But during this time, I was writing short stories, and I actually wrote a novel in my mid to late 20s that was terrible. Luckily, it never saw the light of day. I couldn't even get an agent for it. And at that point, I decided, well, I'm not going to try to write a novel. I'd already decided I wasn't going to try to write screenplays because that was just too much of a hustle. So I said, I'm going to just start writing short stories. And nothing's ever going to happen. I'm never going to get rich off this anyway. So I'm going to do what I love. And at that time, I loved short stories. So I started writing short stories. I'd go home every night after work. That was the best thing about having this corporate 9 to 5 job was that finally it allowed me to get structure in my life, which allowed me to set time aside to actually write. So for years and years, I was writing short stories for, well, I got 7, 8 years before I ever even got one published in a real magazine, in a magazine where nobody knew me. I just sent it in over the transom and I got published. But it's like they say, and something had happened at that point. I had unlocked a voice that editors liked because as soon as I published that, I started getting published all the time in these university journals. I was getting, and they pay you in 3 copies. So, and then I did that for another 10 years, working a day job. I left Flint. Well, they closed. Nirvana killed heavy metal, and so my magazine, tried to keep up, but just the audience had moved on from the metal thing, and our magazine still had the taint of metal on it. So the magazine sort of shut down. I got laid off. I ended up getting another job a few years later at on a trade newspaper for the radio industry, and I did that for 10 years. But all this time, I was going home, working on these short stories. I'd send them out. They'd get rejected. And back then, you weren't supposed to double submit, so you're mailing it and you're waiting 6 months to a year to hear about your story before you're going to send it to someone else, which is stupid. I don't know why I just didn't send. How are they ever going to know that I double submitted? But I'd wait and wait and did it by the rules. And so some of those stories that ended up in Dead Boys had been going around to magazines for like 8 years when that book got published. So I
Yeah,
don't
so I
know.
want to talk about Dead Boys, but I guess so that came out in 2007, and
Hmm?
from what I can tell here, your story Bank of America ended up being in Best American Mysteries. No, wait, no, yes, Best American Mystery Stories 2004. So like you were having some accolades in terms of, I mean, because being a short story writer is tough because you feel like a lot of times the only people who are reading these magazines are just other writers. There's not
It's
like,
true. It's
unless it's
true.
like the New Yorker or like Atlantic,
Yeah.
like, it's like mostly just other writers are just reading these stories. But like when you have a story that actually then gets republished in like a year's best, that's a little bit, it's like, oh, that's a much bigger audience. So, like, were you getting like those accolades, or like was that the very first time you had something that got reprinted, or did you have any of those like,
But that was a
honorable mentions before?
that was a big thing. But like they say, it's only the people, other writers who read those, but also who read those or used to anyway. I don't know if they do anymore. Were agents.
Agents. Yeah.
And so that's what happened to me was an agent read one of my stories. I don't know if it was in Best American Mystery or if it was in one of the journals, but a guy got in touch with me and said, "Hey, do you have enough stories for a collection?" And at this point, I was 40, 41,
Who was
years
it, by
old.
the way? Was it
Huh?
Nat?
No, that guy, he always sent me crap, and I'm like, yeah. He sends every writer I know that same letter that he sent me 30 years ago. No, this was a guy who had been working for an agent out here, and he wanted to go out on his own. I submitted Dead Boys to the agent, and they'd rejected it. But he'd read, he'd read my stories, so he was like, "Oh, I want to take this guy on as my first client in my new business." So that's what happened. I became his first client, and he said, "Do you have enough for a collection?" I said, "Man, I've been publishing stories for 10 years. I have enough for a collection. I've been waiting for your call." And he said, "Unfortunately, you're going to need a novel, or at least the beginnings of a novel, because I can't sell
Yeah.
a book of short stories on its own. Because all the publishers are going to want a novel attached."
Yeah. No, I mean, you were part of the golden age where publishers were actually, publishing short stories. I mean, they still do it nowadays, but it's only if you're like George Saunders or like Lauren Groff or,
When
Joe
I was
Scow
doing it, it
Oates.
was all everybody's first book was always a book of short stories.
Yeah.
That's how you broke in, was through a book of short stories.
So with Dead Boys, did you already kind of have that ready, or at that time did you then have to compile what you thought would be what would
I
make a
tell
good
you this,
collection?
I think there are 13 stories in Dead Boys. Those were all the stories I'd ever written to that point. I had
Okay.
nothing.
So it was just like, okay,
I
here
cleaned
are
the
my
drawer
stories.
out, and they'd all been published elsewhere first. So they would all been published in magazines. But yeah, I had 13 stories, and that was it. I had no more short stories at all. So it was easy to sit down and start a novel.
Yeah. Well, and then with Dead Boys, so I'm always curious when it comes to short story collections, when you compiled those, like, from the first story to the end, was there any rhyme or reason to that? Sometimes I don't know, like how,
There
how
might
did you
have
go
been
about?
there might have been something. It wasn't like I sat down, and I know guys that make charts and stuff, and I didn't do that. I think it was between me and the editor. She might have actually suggested that a story that I wanted, first come second, or we went between. It was between me and the editor coming out on the sequencing of that, and it wasn't any grand design or anything like that. But, if it reads like that, fantastic. But most of the time, any kind of grand design anybody finds in my work is completely luck, because it just that's not the way I sit down and think about things.
Right. So you had those short stories, and then yes, so okay, so it was a two-book deal where they sold it as a short story collection plus a future novel.
That's what he sent it out as, and I had written about a third of a novel. It was this big multi-character a multi-character novel about an earthquake in LA, and like it was kind of a disaster movie in a book. And so had this literary bent, and none of the publishers wanted that novel. They all wanted Dead Boys, but nobody wanted that novel. So he said, "Well, we've got these people want Dead Boys, but you've got to. They all want to talk to you and see if you have another idea for a novel that you're ready to do." And I'm like, okay. So I ended up being on the phone with like Sonny Mehta and like all the heads of these publishing companies, because they all wanted Dead Boys really bad. So they were bidding, and there was an actual bidding war. And I was in Belize. This was years ago when you couldn't get phone reception in Belize. And so like my agent's like, well, he's unavailable. He's in Belize. He can only be available. And they're like, oh, this has got to be some negotiating tactic, that he's playing hard to get. But it was true. I was in Belize in my underwear, drinking out of a bottle of rum, talking to Sonny Mehta. He was flying on a plane somewhere, and I just was pitching the idea for This Wicked World, and I didn't really have a idea, because I don't plot. I just like, yeah, it's about dog fighting in the desert, and there's counterfeit money, and just like threw out some buzzwords, and they went for it. And Little Brown ended up making a high offer. And so suddenly I had a two-book deal for Dead Boys and a novel TBD that I had not even written a word on. And that became This Wicked World.
So okay, so that's interesting. That was something I wanted to get to. So you're not, and I always hate the term, pantser plotter, but so you are somebody who just kind of, you have maybe like an opening or maybe a character and just kind of go from there. You don't necessarily, I mean, do you typically though have an end point in mind? Like, do you have a rough idea of where you think the book is going to end?
Yeah, I usually have a beginning and an ending, and then just a rough like for an example, the smack was sort of based. Part of it is based on a real case. Angel Baby is based on a real case. In fact, This Wicked World is based on a real incident involving this counterfeit money that I read about. So the first three crime books were all based on articles from the LA Times. But the smack, I knew I wanted to incorporate this plot among some soldiers in Afghanistan to send money back to the U.S., steal money from the U.S. government, send it back to the U.S., and then they'd all split it up among each other. Of course, everything goes wrong with that, and people get greedy. But I knew that was in there, and then I just had to come up with the character who I was going to who was going to be the good guy, who wasn't involved in this plot. He's not necessarily a good guy, but he's not in this plot. He's up against these people. So then that's when the work on the book became. I had to start thinking, oh, kind of want to write a con man. So I'll write about this con man, and it just kind of took off from there. And I knew what the ending was. In my new one, it's the same thing. I kind of had the one I'm working on now, same deal. But I knew the beginning and I know the ending, and it's somehow how I'm gonna get there. But I'm interested in a lot of things when I'm doing the books. Like I'm always looking for a structure, like something interesting, ways to break the lately, especially too, since Rovers, to break the chapters or jump out of the narrative voice. I kind of got bored with just doing a straight narrative, so I've been trying to find ways to screw things up. But yeah, anyway, what happens is usually I get about halfway through. It's changed so much from what I thought it was going to be that the ending's still the same, but now I have to figure out an entirely new way to get to the ending. And literally, I'll just be sitting there like going, "Holy shit! How do I make this all work out?" And
Yeah.
it's one of my least favorite moments in writing. That's when you really doubt yourself and you just say, I'm an idiot. Why did I just keep going? Well, I blah, blah, blah. But then somehow it's always worked out, and I've always managed to pull it together and bring it together in the second half. And you might have to make a few adjustments in the beginning to make it line up, but it usually works out. But I'm definitely a bite of the seat of the pants kind of writer, just because it's a cliche. But I feel that if I surprise myself as I'm going along, or well, I want to take some tangent, and I'm not allowed to do that by this rigid plot I've got, that I'm not going to find the interesting things, and I'm not really going to surprise the reader. So, you surprise yourself, you surprise the reader, and sometimes I do end up surprised. So,
Yeah. So this Wicked World was your first published novel. Obviously, we know now it's not your first novel.
mhm.
What at that point though, how many other novels or unfinished novels have
That's
you
it.
written?
That was it. I wrote the one I wrote the one in my late 20s, which I would never show anyone ever, and I don't even have a
Did
copy of
that
it.
one lean more crime though? I mean, what type of genre would you say that
It was a
was?
crime thing.
Yeah.
Had a crime element to it. It was about art forgery, and it was set in L.A., but it was shit. And then I had the beginning of the novel that nobody wanted, and that was it. I'd never
Hmm.
the 13 stories and those two things, and that was all I'd ever written.
So
That's all I'd
so
ever written
all
seriously with intent to sell. I mean,
right.
I'd written stuff, but this was the serious stuff. I was never a when I sit down to write, I'm writing to sell. I'm not writing journal entries or
Yeah.
like about my life. And I'm I want to write books.
So had you written any short stories that then you did? I mean, so you mentioned the 13 stories in Dead Boys. Like, had you at that point had you had any unpublished stories?
No,
So every story that you've written at this point has gotten published. That's pretty
absolutely.
amazing. That
Yep,
doesn't happen often.
I know. Yep. I mean,
But
there's some juvenilia from the beginning, but by the time I started sending out the stories for that eventually became Dead Boys, I'd stopped sending those stories out because I didn't feel they were good enough anymore.
right.
Something changed in my early 30s, and I became a better writer in the matter of 6 months. I read Jesus' Son, and I read a book called Horse for Gloria by William Bullman, and like they had as big an impact on me as Carver and Hemingway and Bukowski did in the beginning of my career. They had as big, they caused as big a paradigm shift, and suddenly after that, I began to write stories in a voice that editors
Yeah.
like, kind of kept
Um,
that voice in everything.
Before we move on, I want to jump back to you mentioned in I guess you said high school you were writing like plays that the school put on. Do you remember
That
like do
was
you still
in,
have that play?
that I do have the play that we put on in fifth grade. It was
Oh, fifth grade. Jeez.
yeah, fifth grade. Two kids don't want to do their history homework, and time, this woman, appears to them and takes them back through history, where great events in American history are relived on stage by, the kid that my fellow students had to act, as Neil Armstrong on the moon, George Washington chopping down a cherry tree. Like, they were just, it was a series of vignettes. It's hilarious, but, that's where my head was then.
And so were you like did you just do that on your own or were you asked to do that? I mean,
No, I
how
just did it.
like
I did it on my own. I also wrote this great Civil War drama about two brothers who were on. I was fascinated by the Civil War in those days, and two brothers who were on either side of, one was a Confederate, one was a Union guy, and they meet up, and I think I was inspired a lot by movies I was watching then. I was,
yeah.
I'd see a movie and then want to kind of recreate it, and that was big for me when I was a kid. Films were important.
And then you said there was the poem you had. Why did they think you had plagiarized it?
I don't know, they just thought it was not something that a sixth grader would write. So it wasn't anything special. I also have that somewhere. In fact, I just got it from my mom. But it was like a horror poem. It was kind of was Edgar Allan Poe influenced, at that
Mm.
point. And so it was sort of my Poe imitation. And I guess I must have been good because the teacher didn't think I'd done it myself.
All right, so okay, so this Wicked World first novel, you follow that up with
Angel
Angel
Baby.
Baby, and then you have, of course, your second short story collection, which again, it's rare enough for someone to have one short story collection come out with a publisher. You had a second one come out, so this one out, and going back to T.C. Boyle, he says on his blurb that your stories are a revelation. He is Raymond Carver reborn in a hard cityscape. Read him and be amazed pretty good. So,
Thanks, Tom.
well, there was the thing. So I guess one of the reasons I see you more quote unquote literary is you utilize and a lot of I think more writers are doing this nowadays. Jordan Harper famously has been doing this as more recent books. Third person present tense. You utilize the present tense. However, with the smack, that was past tense. So like when you are approaching a novel, do you typically kind of just, like how do you know, okay, this book, because then I want to talk about Rovers where you have not only different tenses, you have different voices, because most of your novels have been third person, but with Rovers you utilize two sets of first person. So like I don't know, like, is it one of those things that you immediately from the jump know, okay, this is how I'm going to tell the story? Or is it one of those, maybe you start a couple chapters, it's just not feeling right, you have to go back?
Yeah, I think I've even written like, the first couple of paragraphs and started in one voice and said, no, that doesn't work. And then, I'll try it the other way and I'll go, this is the way to go. Uh, the one thing I stopped myself from doing was writing in first person because all of my short stories in Dead Boys were all first person. And I felt like I had done that to death. And frankly, it was kind of easy for me to do that, to create things in first person. So one thing I do as a writer is I always challenge myself. I'll put, restrictions on myself or, uh, you know, different, yeah, like restrictions, like I'm going to do this, but I'm not going to do like, okay, you can't write first person anymore. Now you're going to write third person and force myself, challenge myself. It keeps it interesting for me. And, so like sort of with each book, especially after the smack, I've been sort of like setting myself a new challenge on each one to try to try to just, I don't know, break out of any molds that I was started, any kind of shell that was starting to form around me. I wanted to break it open and keep expanding and keep getting better and keep getting bigger. And it's no way to run a career, but it's the way it's the way I work and the way I want to work. And at this point, it's hard enough to, I'm not going to worry about selling books. I'm gonna do what I want to do. I'm naturally attracted to stories that readers want to read. Like I like books where things happen, novels especially where things happen, and so I keep that part of the novel moving on, but I'm just trying to experiment more with narrative forms and things like that, especially in Rovers, as you say.
Yeah,
But
let's
yeah, so I got a second book of short stories. I told this is my first attempt to ruin my career. I told them I'm going to put out a book of short stories next, and they said, "No, you aren't. You're you've you've built a crime audience with these two books. Well, I wouldn't call it an audience. Some people have read these two books, and those people might not want to read another book of your short stories, and so you should write another crime novel." And I said, I'm not going to do that. I go, I'll write one after the book of short stories. And I've been working on those short stories for like since Dead Boys was published. I'd started writing short stories again, sending them out, getting them published. And I think another one got in Best American Mystery Stories. And I've had two in there, two or three. And so I just, I had them there. I had them ready to go, 12 stories or whatever it is. And they said, all right, whatever, you can do it. It's a two-book deal. And that was the last two-book deal I got. But they said, give us the book of short stories and then you owe us a crime novel. And I kind of had the idea for the smack once again, pitched it very loosely. They said, okay, let's do it. And then signed me up for two more books.
yeah. And again, I think it's kind of like the end of an era because again, short story collections are you do not find those much anymore. Um, Going back to the short stories, going back to Dead Boys, going back to this, when the stories appeared in the collections, were they as they were initially, or did you kind of like maybe when you were reading through them again, being like, ah, you know what, maybe I can kind of like polish them up even more?
No, I just put them directly in from the journals. My editor might have had some notations somewhere. It's mainly like consistency stuff. Like the normal stuff. They're like, why does everybody drink Pepsi? Like, oh, because I like Pepsi. So then I have to go back and change up the soft drink. Like in the stories are, the small things like that. They help. They help prevent that stuff. But no, man, I was sick of those. This is my problem. As soon as I finish something, when I'm done, the novels, the stories, I never want to look at them again. I'm
Yeah.
sick of them. I like put my whole life into them for however long it took to do it. And like when I'm writing, I'm like wrapped up in it. I mean, it's everything. It's my brain's working on it all the time, even when I don't want it to. I mean, it's bad. So when I'm done and after the editing, the which is always another hard process, then I'm just like I can't look at that again. Also because I know everyone's a failure. None of them turned out to be what I wanted them to be. It's just that's a condition I have. It's like it was good, but it it didn't get there. It didn't do everything I thought it was going to do the moment I sat down when I began that book. What I thought it was going to be, it never done it. I've never had one that's done that yet. So, but it keeps me trying.
Even
You
though at
know,
least like three of them have been reprinted in Best American, one of them won the short story Dagger award.
I just it keeps me trying. I mean,
So when you're writing a short story, I mean, say like a 5,000 word short story, how long does that typically take you? Like, are you able to do a first draft on like, just like on one go or I mean, how many drafts do you do before it gets, you start submitting?
a 5,000 word story, which is like I either write 5,000 or 10,000. Like those are the two lengths of my short stories. Uh, 5,000 can take 4 months. 10,000 has taken as long as 9 months. And that's all I'm working on. It's just, but a lot of those are written while I had day jobs, especially in Dead Boys. So I didn't have as much time. The stories in uh, Sweet Nothing were I had all day now because I've been a full time writer since I got that first two-book deal. So I haven't had a day job again. So now when I did the second batch of short stories, I had a lot more time to devote. So it didn't take quite as long on those. But yeah, I mean it's long on. Plus, if you count all the time when those stories in Dead Boys would come back and get rejected, and I'd work on them again and again. So there's like so many man hours put into that. It's crazy. It's never going to pay me like what it's worth, what it took out of me in sweat. I'm never going to get that in dough for anything.
Yeah. So being a full-time writer, do you try to write every day? And again, I understand writing, like, sometimes I just had a conversation with Rob Hart where there's this advice out there which isn't necessarily great where you have to like produce new pages every day. I know like Walter Mosley would say like, writing is like thinking about writing. You might not necessarily be writing new words, but you're still thinking of the book, you're still thinking of the characters, you're still kind of working through plot points. Like when you're working on a novel, like what's a typical, I guess, day for you?
uh, See, luckily for me, I developed pretty good discipline because of having a day job for years. I worked a 9 to 5 job. I had to come home and work at night. Plus, I was disciplined enough to go to a 9 to 5 job, which a lot of writers I know don't have that. But I had, I was a great worker at my job, and I could come home and block in that time. But so once I became full time, I I usually work about 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, and then an hour at night, that's usually like editing or inputting because I handwrite in pencil on in notepads like this. I handwrite in these notepads, so I have to input it very quickly because I can't read my own handwriting after a couple days, and literally I can't. And so I have to get it in there while I can still recall what I had put on the page. I'll be agonizing over this. I know this was the perfect word. What was this fucking word right here? And my handwriting is so terrible because when I get going, I'm just like pop, pop, pop. Working pretty fast.
Yeah.
I don't have any kind of. I go by time, not by page. I mean, I put in those days and gotten a paragraph.
Yeah.
So, it depends. But I generally write 4.5 days a week, five. Maybe I might input on the weekend or do some editing on the weekend. But on the weekends, I like to spend time with my wife. So, she works a regular job. So the weekends are usually devoted to hanging out with her. So it's, Monday through Friday thing, just like a regular job, and then 6 o'clock comes and the beer comes out and like the work week's over and until Monday morning when I have to start over again.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about Rovers, okay? Again, seeing you as a quote unquote crime novelist, when did the idea come to almost kind of, I guess, basically play with a completely different genre? I mean, in a way, you could say it's like a crime novel, but like it's essentially a vampire novel, which doesn't really even use the term vampire at all in it. So, like, I mean, what was the response from the publisher when we went with these crime novels, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, I have this book.
Yeah, well, the way it works with me and the publisher is that I don't even tell them what I'm working on. I just write the book and then I send it. I don't let anybody read it. I send it. My wife reads it, and because she's my wife, she has to say it's great, and she does. And then I send it to my agent. He's like, yeah, yeah. But he was the first person to say, holy shit, a vampire book? And I'm like, yeah, that's what I want to do this time. And he's like, "Oh man, times are tough, selling books. The Smack did great. Like, and I'm like, no, this is what I'm going to do. If they don't want it, someone will take it." And so went to Little Brown to my editor, and she's like, "Holy shit!" She doesn't really say that to me. She's like, "Oh, a vampire novel." She's a diplomatic person, and but they went for it. It was good enough. It compelled them enough that I I think I did a good enough job on it that it won them over. They're like, well, it's not what he's doing, but it's a good book, so we'll publish it. And they let me swerve. They didn't drop me or didn't say anything. They just said like, okay, this is your book. And I did a lot of that was the book where I was started doing these restrictions. Like you say that it doesn't say vampire in it, and that was a conscious thing. I wanted to write a vampire novel without saying vampire in it, but I ended up having to use it a couple times just because you can't have people explaining to another person like
Right.
these guys are, you have to say they're vampires. So
Well, we would
I
say
had
the
to,
vampires themselves don't call themselves vampires.
right.
There's the term rovers, which, by the way, I mean, where did that come from? Where you decided to use rovers?
Yeah. I don't know. I just didn't want to write a regular vampire book. Once again, when I started writing crime, I hadn't read that much crime. I still haven't, but I had an idea, I'd seen movies and stuff. So when I started writing a horror novel, I have read less horror than I've read crime, like I think I read some Stephen King books when I was in high school or something, but, I've never read a horror novel as an adult. And so, I don't know. I just said I'm going to do it. I'm going to go in here. I know how to tell a story. I can mess this up enough that it's not going to matter that it's not a typical. So I used what rules of vampires that I wanted to use. I gave them another name, called them Rovers. I decided to break it up into there are four narrative voices in the book. There is the the one brother. That's the basic plot. The elevator plot was of mice and men, with vampires. So you have the brothers, the mentally challenged brother and the other brother, which they're not brothers in of mice and men. They're co-workers, but they're brothers in my book. And you say you have the mentally challenged one and the other brother. So some of the chapters are told from the point of view of the first brother. Some of the chapters are told from the point of view of the mentally challenged brother in sort of in the way that he sees the world, which is kind of going back to a Faulkner novel, Benji Compson in The Sound and the Fury. That's kind of like where that voice comes from. There's a part that's letters or a diary, journal letters, which of a guy who's looking for his son who was killed by vampires. That's an homage to the original Dracula, which was all told through letters, diaries, actually audio tapes. They had wires, like those kind of wire recorders. So some of Dracula's transcripts of wire recordings. So that was like a little bit of an homage to the original book. And then the fourth section is following around a group of vampire rover bikers who are the villains of the piece. So so I can divert the story in different ways. You do those things so you just don't have to stay with the main characters all the time. I like to bust off and write about other people within it instead of just being stuck with the main character. So yeah, I mean it was a challenge. It was like I said, it was four different voices, a lot of things that would make the publisher be like, nah, nah, nah. But they went for it, and it's Stephen King blurbed it, and it was
Yeah, I mean Stephen King. He said on I guess Twitter at the
Twitter.
time when Twitter was Twitter. He says want a book that will scare the daylights out of you this weekend. Rovers by Richard Lange, the best vampire novel I've read since Let the Right One In. And then of course his son Joe Hill said Rovers is a lean, mean, pulp masterpiece of American horror. I was blown away. And Publishers Weekly gave it a starred review, said it outstanding supernatural noir. So the publisher definitely had to be happy with
Yeah,
the
well,
response.
once they started seeing those roll in, they're like super happy, you know. And once they saw sales, it's sold way more than any of the other books. So they're like, oh, okay, you know, like this worked out. We trust him a little. Uh, yeah, I got to thank Joe Hill because I think he got the book to his dad, you know,
Yeah.
because he was an early guy who was in on it, and then that Stephen King's blurb came after the book was out, came on Twitter. So I'm grateful to him that he got it to his dad, and his dad liked it enough to do that because that really helps to get even a little comment like that from Stephen King. It automatically expands the audience of people who are going to read the book. And
Do you
you know,
remember
I
where
don't know
you
if it's going to
were?
get me any more readers because then I went and screwed it up completely with the next book. So
Well, we're gonna get to that. But do you remember where you were when, like
I was in
when someone was
Alaska
like,
on
"Hey, guess what?"
a road trip in Alaska, and I came like, holy shit! I remember my wife in the car, like Stephen King just like commented on Rovers on Twitter, and we were freaking out in the car. Had some extra drinks that night.
So why was it you set the book in the 70s? Was there a specific reason you wanted to set it? Because I think the
Uh,
rest of your novels have mostly what been,
they're contemporary, yeah.
yeah.
Because it's really hard to write a crime vampire thing now with cell phones and video cameras, and it just I wouldn't have been able to tell the story, or it would have been a lot more difficult. I would have had to do a lot more thinking about things that I don't want to think about. Like I'm not interested in that about how to solve these technological problems, in a creative way. That doesn't interest me. So I took it back to the 70s, which was also the Rovers are basically serial killers. They don't bite people in the neck. They cut people's throats and drink their blood. And they move around so they don't get caught. And they live on the fringes of society, attacking prostitutes and homeless people and drug addicts that people nobody will miss. And this was in the 70s was the heyday of the serial killer. I mean, that's when all the big serial killers were operating, and now all of the most famous ones. I grew up in that period and remember being, freaked out by. I was sort of into that serial killer, not fandom, but like fascination with that. Read a lot of books on it. So that was my inspiration more than a horror book. It was more the serial killers of that time. Was something that was more an inspiration for Rovers than any horror book.
Yeah.
But 70s was because it was easier to do and possible.
It looks like the ebook, because I only have the hardcover, but on Amazon it looks like they have like a bonus short story in the
In the
ebook
paperback, I did
or the paperback.
yeah, in the paperback, it's attached to the paperback. I had I had an idea at one point that I would do. I didn't really want to write a sequel, but I thought I could go back and do a book of short stories involving characters from Rovers in different periods in life because it's very rich. Like it it stretches back to biblical times. I mean, if you think about it, these guys have been around forever. So I had different like little stories I dropped in Rovers that I could go back and expand. And so I wrote one about the one of the brothers, the brother going back home it explains sort of why he's traveling around with his mentally challenged brother. And it's an
Yeah.
adventure he had on the way, set in 1932. And so I had this idea that I do that, but then, you know, life got away. And also, I was at that time they were going to do a TV series, and Rovers was going to be a series, and I was trying to come up with things that I could do, like to expand the world of the story that would to put it out into season two, season three, because that's what they want now. They want you to be
Yeah.
projecting out what you're going to do in every season. So my idea was I might help me come up with ideas. Once the TV thing fell apart, I said, maybe
Yeah.
if I get independently wealthy someday, I'll sit down and do that. But right now, I need to start trying to make some more money. I got to contribute to the mortgage here.
Yeah.
So I started another book.
Well, before we get to the most recent novel, yeah, I mean, reading Rovers is one of those things too, where you would think like this, yeah, I mean, because I know that you've had film, TV, interest in the past, and like it's a whole thing, stuff gets optioned here and there, even if it gets optioned, doesn't get made, and even if they buy it, they might do like a pilot, does not necessarily mean it's going to, get greenlit, and so like, have you had anything recently that's like any like movement on anything, or just it's kind of like the same thing where it's like, no real movement? Kind of like the
Everything
development hell type, part of the business.
at this point, two things are optioned. I can't really talk about one.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Rovers is one of them, and it's pretty exciting if what is supposed to happen. It will be a film, not a TV series. But if what happened, what that I'm hearing is going to happen, that we'll see. And then the Smack has been optioned for like 4 years by this company, and they've been telling me they're going to make it. They came close 2 years ago, and no, but recently I'm told it's going to start filming in August. Casey Affleck starring. Uh, you know, we'll see. I'm holding my breath.
Yeah.
I need something like that to go because the options are great, but the money that I would get if it actually went would
Oh,
be
absolutely.
could get me to Social Security or something. I mean, it would be great. So I'm hoping both of those go. But like I've been disappointed so many times before. It's come so
Yeah.
close and then it
Yeah,
doesn't.
no, when it comes to film TV, you can never get your hopes up, even when
Yep.
things look like it's going to happen, because stuff could just, I know a writer who, they had financing, they had a director, they had everything, and then, right before they start filming, one of the actors pulled out, and then the whole thing just fell apart. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
unfortunately, that stuff happens all the time. But real quick, so Rovers, very successful. You decide crime novel next.
Yeah.
So
It's not
like
really.
would the publisher decide? I mean, did the publisher think like, hey, this is great.
Well,
Let's try to do something
it's
similar,
it's
like
it's not even a crime novel. It's a romance. It was it's the only book I've had that was named one of the top romances in the LA Times, hot summer romances in the LA Times, and was reviewed by the crime critic in the New York Times. So
no.
it's more of a hard-boiled love story, kind of like a Cassavetes film. And once again, that freaked out my publisher. They're like, "Oh my God, you're writing a romance novel?" They knew it was a romance novel, but it's what I did is I wanted to go back to the world that was in Dead Boys, this lower, struggling LA that I lived in for a long time. Thankfully, don't now. But this struggle LA, and I wanted to write about a guy who was 40 years old and a bartender and a war vet and a ex-con who's just like getting by in LA and the struggle of getting by. And he meets a crazy rich woman, and they have this whirlwind. They call them in French amour fou, a crazy love. Like this, they come together and all kinds of crazy stuff happens. There's a road trip across the United States from LA to Austin. Uh, there's drugs, there's guns, there's the trappings of crime, but it's far from crime. And believe me, I know that because the reviews that you get on Amazon, they're like, "This is not a crime novel. Why did Sarah Weinman review this in the Times? It's not crime." And the romance people are like, "Oh my God, this is the most awful, horrible book about horrible people. Like this is not a romance. These people are losers. Like, why should I care about these scumbags?" And so, it got reaction.
Well, reaction's better than no reaction. Yeah,
Yeah,
Publishers Weekly, another starred review says it may be the best novel yet from the always reliable Lang. That had to be nice.
yeah. I am
So
reliable.
all right, so we are actually, yeah, we are about an hour. The ebook of and I don't know if you remember this because it has been a while, but This Wicked World, at the end of the ebook, you have a list of your top 10 great crime films and your top 10 great crime novels. Do you remember any of those?
Nope. I'm sure I could guess what some of them would be, but no,
Yeah.
man, no. That was 15 years ago.
Well, let's just run through. I mean, so like we have Point Blank for crime
Yep,
films,
great one.
Centipede, Homicide, Badlands, Gomorrah, Miller's Crossing, The
Great
Long
list.
Goodbye.
Great list.
Great crime novels, A Good Day to Die by Jim Harrison, Billy Felon's Greatest Game, The
By
Day of the Owl,
Kennedy, William Kennedy. That's a
True,
great book. The
True
whole
Crime, an American Anthology, Controlled
great.
Burn.
That's Scott Wolven.
Yeah,
You heard of him, right? I
yeah.
think he just put out another book. It took him 20 years to put out another collection of short stories after Controlled Burn.
The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad, You Can't Win by Jack Black, The Friends of Eddie Coyle, of course, by Higgins, Straight Life. I guess my question is, and of course, Jim Thompson, Savage Knight. Why, out of all the Jim Thompson novels, would you say Savage Knight?
I don't know. I thought it was one of his stranger ones, and it has the great ending, which I sort of ripped off, and it was definitely an influence for. I did another article about five great death scenes or something in books because in Angel Baby there's a weird chapter where a guy is dying and you're inside his head, and so I wrote about five great death scenes in books, and that is the the end of Savage Knight is one where he's getting chopped up with a hatchet and he's still narrating the story as pieces of him are being hacked up in this basement. And like, I forget what the last line is like, and then there was nothing or something, like it was very chilling. And I thought like a really inventive thing for a guy. But, he's an inventive writer. He does what he does better than anybody else, and so many other people try to do what he does, and they just blow at it. So yeah, that just stuck with me, and so he won. I picked that book because I loved the ending,
Yeah,
and it's a cruel book. It's a very cruel book.
yeah. So the last thing I always ask is there anything recently that you've read, watched, listened to that you really dug and would want to recommend to other people?
I'm trying to think of something that I really liked lately. This is going to be weird. It's not a crime book or anything, but it's a book called Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazard, Hazzard. She's a Australian writer. I think the book is about 25, 30, maybe 30 years old, and it's the story of two Australian girls beginning before World War II and moving up, I think, into the 60s. It doesn't sound like it would be anything. My wife said, "You got to read this." And I'm like, yeah, this doesn't sound like it's going to be up my alley. But I totally got involved. The woman is a fantastic writer. And it's as it follows their romantic life, but it also follows history, and it also has some philosophy in it, and it's so well constructed. It took her 20 years to write, so it better be good. And by the end, there's even a huge twist at the end that you didn't see coming, and even within that twist, there's another thing that you won't even know unless you go and read about the book online. You'll be like, there's like two lines in the story in the whole novel that make up this second twist in the book. It's insane, and it was so much fun to read. And just like for pure writing ability, this woman is incredible. So I'll
What's
recommend
it
that.
called again?
It's called Transit of Venus
Transit of Venus. All right. Yeah,
by Shirley
definitely.
Hazard. And it's not crime. It's not, I mean, there's a mystery at the heart of it, sort of, but it's much bigger than that.
Oh, oh, interesting. I'm looking up now. Oh, National Book Critics Circle Award from 1980, and actually going back to Lauren Groff, she wrote the intro, I guess, to the more
Yeah, the
recent
new
paperback
edition.
version.
Yeah.
So interesting. All right, very good. And then anything else? Anything you've been watching? Any good films, TV?
Yeah, look, these days I watch old stuff, like Broadway Melody of 1940. I mean, I don't know. New movies aren't doing it for me. I started watching The Burrows. Didn't, it's not doing it for me. kind of enjoying. I like the lowdown. We'll see what happens. They have a new series, new second season's coming up, so that was something I liked. I liked that the one that was, what was it called? Stakeout. I can't remember, but it was a. I watched some of those crime ones, but truthfully, nah, it's mostly old movies. I'll go watch Point Blank again, or Miller's Crossing, or one of the ones off that great list.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, if people want to stalk you online, where's the best way to do that?
I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. Your publisher wants you to be on all those things, even though they're a real pain in the ass and sort of embarrassing to do. But yeah, I'm on Instagram and Facebook and Blue Sky and just not Twitter.
Yeah. So, all right, Richard, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time. I don't want to keep you any longer. Everybody go check out all of Richard's, many books, short story
I
collections.
follow all those the twists and turns of my career, and the new ones even crazier. It's a giant twist. So
New one is the one you're working on now.
the one I'm working on right now is even weird. Is the strangest one I've done yet, and the biggest swerve that I've done yet. So it should be, if it gets published, it would be in a couple, a year and a half or so. Keep an eye out. I'll start talking about it more on my social media when things, when I get closer to it. But I think I have another year to go writing it. So
Okay, cool. All right. Well, again, Richard, thank you so much for hanging out. And yeah, we'll see everybody next time. Bye.